well, sure, we'll carry on like
Okay.
your introduction. So
Great. Well, I suppose, yeah, just it gets me thinking back to how the whole genesis of the anthology really started and when it started. Do you remember, Claire?
Yeah, our annual Christmas dinner last year. As I always say to people, it's a pre-lockdown project, even though we did it during lockdown. But yes, we came up with it last Christmas, and we have always been up for Christmas dinner, and we're sort of chatting, thinking we didn't think that Northern Ireland had like any short story anthologies, and they've only just started to have sort of recent anthologies as well of actual Northern Irish writers. So,
and when there are anthologies, then it's very often very samey.
Yeah, and they're often people are
names over and over, and we kind of thought, with you writing, fantasy, magical realism, and being more crime and dark comedy, that kind of thing, I know that there has been anthologies that are, multi-genre or more sci-fi, but we like the idea of something that went across the genres, didn't we, to really put a spotlight on genre writers in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, just something to showcase the range, because as you say, like we kind of thought sometimes with these collections, people, more well-known writers are invited to join, so it's not open submissions. We kind of like the idea open the submissions to like anybody in Northern Ireland, and then instead of just having it like all crime or like all fantasy, or try and just get a good mixture of, just to show the different things people are writing, and to show, whether to try and include, the quality of the stories was first, but we also we're hoping, as I think we have done, to include people that have been published before, but also people who haven't been published before, and get a mixture sort of across the board. So
and also it was important to us because when we made up for our Christmas dinner, I don't know if you know, but I live in Newtonards and Claire lives in the North Coast, so we would kind of meet in a halfway point, and we kind of thought, rural writers as well. We wanted, and we didn't want just, Belfast centric, you would know, Claire, and I know I travel a little way, but if you go to a book event,
I'm always giving off saying everything's in Belfast and nothing's on the North Coast.
Yeah. So yeah, we wanted writers from, a good representation of all around Northern Ireland, didn't we? But as time went on and we were getting submissions, and then I think, I started to feel like we really just have to go with the quality of the stories. We can't say, oh, this one's going to go in because it's in this county. But it just so happened that there was a lovely cohesiveness of the stories, wasn't there? And that they were well spread out. What do you think?
Yeah, because we did pick, like, because we did like a long list of like the ones that we liked, and we did agree, like most of them we did agree on, and like the final ones we sort of, like we liked all the stories that we settled on, but obviously there were some differences, and then as we were going along, and we kind of, but it was definitely worked out on like which ones we thought fit the profile for what the anthologies was to be like, the quality of the writing, just the story, how interesting and everything it was. And then just when we looked at that, it was like, well, actually there is a good balance of where people are from. That was the last thing we kind of did look at, but then we were like, well, this is good, because we don't really have to, because you wouldn't want to put in somebody from somewhere if the story was something that really didn't fit the book, so. But
it was just nice because we'd had that conversation at the start to say, it would be nice if it was a good representation as well, of different areas. And
then the funding, I suppose, was a big thing as well, because a lot of things, like, as Kelly, we both know, and different people here will know as well, like getting paid for your work as a writer, it's very important, and people are always trying to get you to do stuff for free. So we were very much determined, it's like, we're going to apply to the Arts Council for funding, and we want to pay the writers and make sure that everybody gets a fee for their story. And, especially I suppose with all the COVID stuff happening afterwards, that's even more important. But I think it's just important anyway that, you get paid for your work. And then the charity thing sort of grew out of that as well. We're like, well, let's, we don't want to be the ones profiting from this book, because it's not for us to be making money out of it. So let's give it to charity. So that was another thing that we came up with.
That's right. And having to try to set up a bank account in March. It was just around the time of
Yeah.
lockdown, wasn't it? It all went very, very differently than what we thought, and even the whole Christmas story will be very different this year. So I think it's fitting that it has those quirky, kind of different alternative Christmas stories in it too, as well as the traditional story.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely need a good mix. I know, and it's funny the way that everything that thankfully we got the news of the funding and everything. I think we got that start of February, just before everything kicked off. But then as everything kicked off with COVID, that's when we were accepting it and sorting out stuff with the Arts Council and sorting out stuff with the bank account, sorting out all sorts of stuff. And then we weren't able to meet either because we live so far away from each other and all this social restrictions and distancing and everything. So, but yeah. But we got it done. So
and I think it's pretty amazing. As a credit to the people that did submit, that during like the hardest time, April whenever we opened the submissions, people were going through lockdown and they were being asked to write a Christmas story in April. And
I know that's true.
they were really inundated, and we thought, I just want to get anything new, and we had to turn away a lot of really fantastic stories as well, didn't we? Because we got so many, and these were
we got a good amount sort of steadily, didn't we? But then just that last weekend, we just got so many, and because I was thinking, all right, this, at the start, I was like, we've got a good amount, that's great. And then all of a sudden, there's just so many, and there were a lot of good stories that we had to turn around. That's why as we both would always say to people, as we know as well, like we have short stories rejected for stuff, and it's like, it's not because they're not good, it's just because maybe we have got another story of that genre already or something similar to it, or it's not because it's not a good story, and we did have a lot that we had to turn around.
It's interesting to see that. I'd seen that doing the incubator as well, putting together something that's cohesive and get stories. I think it is interesting for people to know that, and to see that firsthand as an editor, that you like this story, but as you say, it's the same, very similar to another one, or it is it's the same theme, or you've already got too many first person points of view, or whatever it would be, so I'm trying to put it all together. But I think it's came out really well, and we're really proud of it, aren't we?
Yeah, no, I think it's I'm really excited now that people are going to get to read it all, and I think that it's worked out that, as you say, it flows nicely, and Kelly's very much more experienced putting together anthologies and the journal, her incubator journal and things, than me. So with the flow of the ordering of the stories is very important as well, and making them going from each one, like that's all very carefully thought out. So I think it works really well, so hopefully everybody else will think so as well.
And it's funny, just because we are such different writers and we like such different genres, but it's Christmas stories, different genres. You had your what about fantasy, magic realism, and we're able to bring that, and then I would bring, you're like the light in the dark. It was like
I know Kelly likes a lot of dark stuff, but I need to I like too, but yeah, I definitely we're very different writer, which is good, because I think that if we were both exactly the same, it might have been a very different anthology. So at least two very different, similar but also different points of view sometimes. Yeah, it works.
What do you think? Will we get on to the readings?
Yes, I think so. I know we've had a few messages here from people who haven't difficulties joining, so hopefully everybody will get to join in. But yeah, I think we should crack on.
Okay, great. Well, if anyone has had the chance to have a look at the anthology or read it or anything yet, it goes in a certain order, and it starts off with Gary McKay, who's going to be our first reader. I'm just going to give a little introduction for Gary and for his story. Okay. Gary McKay is a speculative fiction writer from Creighton who consumes too much tea and chocolate. He's currently working on his first novel and has had stories published in Creighton magazine, The Purple Breakfast Review, and Tidbits, and can be found on Twitter at Gary McKay. And the first story in Underneath the Tree is Candy Cane's Comics and Christmas, and it's a tale of friendship and support. It's written with a striking first-person voice, but also a young person. And McKay takes us to different Christmases over time, over the years, as the story unwinds. And now Gary will share an extract from Candy Canes, Comics and Christmas.
Thank you very much. Okay. I didn't realize someone was already there until I rounded the final bend of the hill. It was a girl with short blonde hair, dressed in a jumper and skirt. A necklace with a series of stars on it hung from her neck. I paused and considered retreating, but she'd seen me. The girl waved and skipped over before I could move. Hi. Hi. I'm new in town. I nodded, unsure what else to say. Do you like comics? She'd seen my Spider-Man bag. Tentatively, I nodded again and waited for the insults to fly. I was tired of being told superhero comics weren't for girls, that I should stick to Bunty, Barbie dolls, and unicorns. Why couldn't I enjoy what I wanted in peace? The girl's face lit up with the brightest smile I'd ever seen. Even her eyes seemed to glow for a second. That's so cool. I love superheroes. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I'd never met another girl who liked superheroes, and feared I never would. Not in Ballykey, anyway. I'm Marlene, by the way. Annie. Pleased to meet you, Super Annie. I grinned. No one had ever called me that before. I fished in my bag and pulled out a well-worn Batman issue. Do you want to read this with me? Yeah. We skipped over to a tree and spent the afternoon reading comics beneath it. I didn't have a best friend, had never had one, but by the end of that afternoon, I knew Marlene was mine. It was also the start of my most important Christmas tradition. What if Batman and Spider-Man got into a fight? Marlene and I were huddled over an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man in her room, listening to the rain beat against the roof. A typical summer's day in Northern Ireland. I shrugged. Spidey would win, no bother. Marlene chewed reflectively on a candy cane, of which she had a seemingly never-ending supply. Whatever the season, a candy cane was rarely far from her mouth. Batman might have a cool gadget to stop him, though. What, a can of spider-repellent bat spray? Marlene giggled. Last month, a nearby cinema has screened a 1966 Batman film starring Adam West and Burt Ward as part of the run-up to the release of the new Batman film in August. Marlene and I pooled our pocket money together and had just enough for 2 tickets, popcorn, and a return bus fare. So far, it had been the highlight of an uneventful 1989, particularly the part where Batman fought off a shark with a can of bat spray. You think the new one will be any good, Annie? Well, the costume will do rightly, but Michael Keaton doesn't have much of a chin. I smirked. Nice art, though. Marlene opened her mouth to reply, but coughed instead. You okay, Marl? She nodded and looked mournfully at the candy cane, now in bits on the floor. Outside, the rain somehow intensified. I glanced at the window and froze. The wall wasn't there anymore. I stared through the hole in the house at the outside world and tried to understand what had happened. How could a wall disappear? My head throbbed, a deep, sharp pain to force my eyes shut. When I opened them again, a moment later, the wall was back. I leaned over and put my hand against it. It was solid. I waited for it to disappear again, but nothing happened. I hadn't had much sleep the night before, but that had never caused hallucinations. You okay, Annie? I felt Marlene's hand on my shoulder and turned to look at her. Yeah, just the wall. What about it? I considered how silly I'd sound if I said it had disappeared, and decided it must have been the lack of sleep, after all. Nothing. You sure? Yeah, let's get back to the comic. Later, when I was getting ready to go home for dinner, I lingered in the hall, looking at the pictures on the wall. There was a collection of drawings of space, and several pictures of Marlene, but none of her parents. Your parents are wild camera shy, aren't they? I guess so. Her brow furrowed. Annie? Yeah? One day I'm going to up and disappear. What do you mean? She was always coming out with stuff like that. Ma said she was a space cadet. Prophetic words, as it turned out. One day I'll be here, the next I won't. She shivered. Like snow, when the sun comes out. Just like that? Just like that. Not sure how else to react, I laughed. But almost 5 months later, Marlene was gone. And that's me.
Very good. Great, thank you.
Okay.
Good clap. And that feels weird when you're in a online.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Gary. That was brilliant. I'm going to just introduce Sharon Dempsey now. Sharon Dempsey is a Belfast-based crime writer. The first in her new crime series will be published in 2021 by Avon HarperCollins. She is a PhD candidate at Queen's University, exploring class and gender in crime fiction. Sharon facilitates creative writing classes for people affected by cancer and other health challenges, and she also writes plays and short stories. The second story in Underneath the Tree is Sacred Plot. It's an historical tale, dark and detailed. Dempsey provides all the atmosphere to let the reader's mind wander back to a time when Christmas was very different to what we know it to be today. And now Sharon is going to read an extract from The Sacred Plot.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. The pale light in the glen should have told them something was wrong. It was said the sky drained of colour and the naked trees swayed, yet there was no wind. The fierce frost had killed what was left of the valley's lushness the week before, but no one knew what to expect or what was to occur. Hilda Mackin was the first to know. She read it in the flames of the early lit fire. A death was coming, she told her mother, but the old woman sitting in the corner with the baby on her lap told her to whist and stop her superstitious nonsense. Hilda said afterwards she'd seen it, plain as day, in the settling embers that lay in the low grate. The second person to know was Nancy. She arrived at the Beck cottage at 8:30, as was her habit, for she and the daughter Vera Beck walked together to the schoolhouse every day, bringing their lump of coal for the teacher's fire. When Nancy knocked at the door, there was no answer, no shout of "come by here, I won't be a minute," no rustle of morning routines. Nancy knocked twice and thrice, and deducted from a lack of smoke coming from the chimney that all was not well. She reported later to have heard the bray of the family's donkey, giving off that it had no breakfast, and this made her wonder all the more. She peered through the windows but could see nothing untoward, but even so, there was a quietness that was strange and telling. Nancy just didn't know what it was saying. She felt an eerie shudder work its way up her spine and bolted to the closest house to fetch help. Ivan Vanet, the Pole, who came on the prospect of finding love years ago instead, heard the pounding of Nancy's fists on his door all the way to the barn where he was going about his morning's work. "What's going on?" he demanded, unused as he was to small girls assaulting his front door. He took off his felt hat and peered at the child, waiting for a reply. Nancy froze and couldn't say exactly what was wrong, for she had no way of knowing how to put into words her fears and her assumptions. They were too great and too fantastical for normal words to make sense of. Instead, she pointed to the lane from whence she came, and Ivan was forced to follow her as she dragged him by his shirt sleeve, loosening a cuff button with her strength. When they reached the cottage, Nancy hung back and, still wordless, pointed to the smokeless chimney house. Ivan noted the paleness of the child and understood that something was not right, that she had fears and misgivings that found no form in her pearly-toothed mouth. He rattled a sharp knuckle clenched against the green door and stood back. When nothing happened, he walked around the house and found the back door not open but unlocked, and took the liberty to go inside. "Hello," he braved, taking in the scene of the neat kitchen, the range grown cold and the table strewn with letters and dockets. "Hello," he ventured again, louder this time, and direct his call across the stairs. When no response came, he took the stairs two at a time, a cold dread prickling his neck like the kiss of a Sanranka, the whispering witch of his homeland. He stopped suddenly on the landing, for there he could see reflected in the dark glass of the old mirror hanging above a washstand a scene of awful savagery. A tangle of limbs, slick with dark congealed blood, lay splayed on a patchwork eiderdown that covered the metal bed. It was a grotesque tableau that made him think of birth, butchery, or war. I'll leave it there.
A nice degree.
Very good.
Here we clap.
Stuart Wilson. So Stuart
is having difficulties. I don't know what's wrong. He's having passwords and things, or kicking him out. I'm not quite sure. We'll try, hopefully come back to him if he gets in.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just move on then and come back. Okay. Next one then is story by Samuel Poots. Ballymoney writer Samuel Poots is working on his first novel after receiving a General Arts Award from the Arts Council Northern Ireland in 2019. When not writing, he can be seen wandering the coast, muttering about dragons, and if found, please send him home via the nearest post office. So Samuel Poots is going to read from Will She Remember the Lights, which is a story from a different reality, a dystopia where Christmas is managed in a much harder way than we know. And now Samuel Poots will share an extract from Will She Remember the Lights.
Okay, thanks very much. So, I walk to the forest. It's not that I'm ungrateful for the car, but I'm fairly certain it's tracked. It would be silly of the church not to keep an eye on its property, and I know the elders wouldn't understand what I'm doing. If I'm honest, I'm not entirely certain I do either. Dusk gathers quickly at this time of the year, leaching all colour out of the world. By the time I reach my chosen tree, there isn't much light left to work by. It stands at the centre of a cluster of other pines, each one rising up to the sky, branches intertwining with one another to form a great domed cathedral. Compared to those, the one I've selected looks pretty unimpressive. You wouldn't think it was special at all, but for one little girl, I hope it will become a memory she can hold on to. I unload my electrical tools and craft supplies and get to work. Every so often, a stick snaps or a branch creaks, and I pause, not daring to breathe. Security deacons don't have much call to be out this far from the towns, but you never can be too sure. Their zeal for the church is inspiring. I don't continue working until I am sure it was just an animal, and try to ignore the growing prickling feeling on the back of my neck. It's slow going, but fortunately there isn't much left to do. I'm finding a quiet satisfaction from this project, far more than I get just endlessly rewiring the meeting house's old television set. When the last strand of bulbs is hung from the branches, their glass dipped in colourful inks to tint their light, I step back to admire my work. And God said, "Let there be light," and he saw that the light was good. I don't mean to speak the words. They bring a little sting of shame with them, a minor blasphemy, the sort that the Reverend Father warns can build up one upon the other like snowflakes until all the world is swept away by an avalanche of small transgressions. For a second, I want to tear down this thing I've made and fling it back into the distant past where the elders have rightfully confined it. But I can still remember the wonder of those mornings, still remember the feeling of seeing a tree light up a room. And I want Cynthia to have that. Behind me, something rustles in the underbrush. I freeze. Any second, there'll be a yell, a heavy hand on my shoulder, a security deacon reading out the rites of banishment and driving it home with their club. I strain my hearing, waiting for that next sound. Another soft snap of twigs. Could they be sneaking up on behind me? But the security deacons don't sneak. They're the glorious arm of the Reverend Father's will. They don't hide who they are. They declare it for all to know that their time for repentance is now past. Another animal? But I've never heard any that move with that measured tread. I spin around, ready to run at any sign of... It's an invisible. A woman, dressed in an assortment of rags, looks back at me from behind a tree. Her eyes glimmer in the shadows, two bright points in the fading day. We stand there for a long time. A second figure appears beside her, their ragged clothes also marking them as an invisible. Then a third. The whole world grows distant and still as they watch me and I watch them. I turn my back on them and set off as fast as I can walk. I should report them. 3 in one place, and confident to show themselves. Maybe they live there, in the forest. Invisibles are not allowed to make settlements. They must wander forever, never stopping, never resting, doing penance for whatever wrong caused the church to cut off their finances and banish them from all decent society. Everyone who touches them, who even looks at them, is made unclean and must share their fate. No money, no friends, no family, no church, just endless wandering, driven on by the security deacons. I should report them. But then the church would find the tree. Would one good deed outweigh the crime? I walk alone except for my thoughts, and the moon emerging high above, the invisible's eyes shining bright in my mind. And that's me.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
Samuel. Stuart has joined us now.
Just in time. Morna has.
Stuart, are you happy? I know you've only got in now. There are some technical issues, but are you happy to read now? Would you like a little bit of time?
Oh no, I can read now. That's fine.
That would be brilliant. I'm just going to do your introduction, Stuart. Is that okay?
Of course, yes.
Stuart Wilson is a published author who was born in Scotland but raised in Northern Ireland. He's been all over the world and loves to travel and runs his own business teaching first aid. His hobbies include reading, writing, hill walking, sailing, rugby, ice hockey, running, and biathlon. And so Stuart is going to read it's the third story in the anthology, and it is The Man Near the Bus Stop. It is set in one street, and it is a tale of intrigue and ambiguity, and it felt to me like a short movie with this criminal kind of underbelly to it. And now Stuart is going to read an extract from The Man Near the Bus Stop. Thank you.
Thank you. The night was cold. He felt the frost in the air, and his feet had crunched on the thin layer of snow that was on the ground. The darkness of the night was broken by the hiss coming from the streetlights and the glow of the decorated trees in the various windows in the houses. The soft wind moved the trees that lined the road that was in front of him. It's a leafy suburb at Christmas time. You can't miss it. He now smiled at the description he'd been given. He'd been to the city before, but he'd never been to this part. But then, he'd never needed to before. He pushed his hands deeper into the pockets of the thick outdoor jacket. The small woolen hat covered most of his head. He lowered his face into the upturned collar of the jacket, nearly obscuring his face, as he sat motionless on the bench. His feet were warm in the boots he had brought with him, but he was regretting wearing jeans. The cold went straight through them. Behind him, only the trees moved the unlit park as the wind made them creak. Whiffs of snow were picked up by small cyclones and drew lines in the crusted snow on the ground as they danced around the park. The row of detached houses along the street in front of him were each surrounded by their own trees and hedges. All the houses were large and Victorian by design, but looked to have been built in the last 20 years. They all had gravel-covered driveways that led up to the large front doors with ornate furnishings. The windows were designed to look like Victorian design, but the brick and stonework gave it away that they were not. Each house had a small selection of expensive cars, and they all faced into the park, although most were in darkness now. It was a far cry from where he had been raised. He was on the opposite end of the spectrum. He wanted to hate them, but part of him could not. His mind wandered. What kind of people lived here? What jobs in the city did they do? If they saw him sitting in the coffee shop, would they speak to him or just ignore him? He'd been sat there for a while, waiting. No one had spoken to him or even taken any notice of the nondescript man near the bus stop, who had been walking around the park just after sunset, but was now sitting on the bench. Each would later say they were not sure of exactly what time he had arrived. He had been careful. He knew which of the houses had CCTV security, and he had avoided showing them his face. He had easily found the house that he was looking for. The address and description had been precise. The white front door with the large number on it, the Christmas tree in the window to the left of the door with the angel on top, and not a star, like most of the Christmas trees in the street. The black Range Rover and the dark green Aston Martin were parked outside the front door and never in the double garage that had been attached to the side of the two-storey red brick house. He had memorised the registration numbers of both. It was just another confirmation he had the right place. Now he sat on the bench, motionless, waiting. Across the road and down the left was the small bus stop. He had drawn every line of the shelter in his head to pass the time. The shape of the shelter, where the dark green paint was flaking off, the posters and the frames that were mounted on the back of it, the covering that extended a few feet towards the road that would give some cover from the earlier snow, and the small row of red plastic seats that were so uncomfortable no one ever sat there. They were too high for most to sit on. You had to mostly lean against them, but they were there. There was no shelter from the wind. He did not have to look at his watch. He knew it was almost midnight. He did not want to move. He did not want to expose his wrists to the cold, but he had to sit there, waiting, and time was moving slowly, but still he would wait. His eyes looked up at the clouds that covered the sky without moving his head. The roar of the engines of the airplane above the cloud had drawn his attention. He tried not to let a small smile spread across his face as he looked at the clouds. He had seen that type of clouds many times before. It was going to snow again. He knew what types of clouds would bring rain, what would bring snow, and of course, the type that held in the thunderstorm that would make him seek shelter. His eyes caught the movement of the cat from round the tree to his left. His eyes darted over the movement. The cat slowly walked from the far side of the tree, deliberately pacing as it moved towards the road. It stopped. It looked over to him, and it looked as they both paused before the cat broke off the stair and slowly moved off towards the bus stop. He watched as it padded its way around the bus stop and reappeared at the far side, then turned around, sat down, and looked back at him. He smiled. For a moment, he thought the cat had smiled back. There you go.
Thanks so much. That's great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Do a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Claire.
I muted a lot of people there, but that was great. Thank you very much. We're moving on now to a story by someone called Claire Savage. Where's your bio, Claire? Based in Bushmills, Claire Savage is the author of 3 novels for 8 to 12-year-olds, Magical Masquerade and Phantom Fantasia, which are a duology, and The Story Farce, which is publishing in 2020. Claire's short stories and poetry have appeared in various lit journals, and she was one of Ligon Online's 12 new original writers in 2016-17. And Claire's going to read from the 13th Hour, which is a fairy tale, magical realism, and it takes us into nature and the fantasy, as I say. And now she's going to read from the 13th Hour. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to start from the beginning with mine because, yeah. The 13th Hour. Yvain scanned the horizon. The moon owned the sky this Christmas Eve, adorning the countryside with a subtle silver glow. Tonight, she was a full fat orb, suspended in a clear sky twitching with stars. For those abroad, the night nipped at their heels as the hour drew on, the earth cooling and compressing with each passing second. For Yvain, the moonlight was unnecessary, an extravagance that she was not reliant upon, but which, she conceded, didn't exactly encumber her when she was on the hunt. In truth, however, she preferred to be swaddled in darkness. She tilted her head, focusing on the myriad rustlings and scurrying sounds below. She listened to the breeze as it ruffled the grasses, distinguished the snuffling of badger from the footfalls of fox. Bats snipped to and fro in the gloom, their high-pitched sonar bouncing off bark and insect and mammal. She sensed the movements of a shrew, then a pair of field mice as they tiptoed from their fortified burrow, limbs still heavy with sleep. A ribbon of river whispered against banks pockmarked with hidden dwellings. Its soft speech punctuated every so often with murmuring ripples, as an otter, water vole, or rat flipped into its cool depths. Tonight, however, Yvain did not seek prey. There were festivities afoot, and she fully intended to join them. She just needed to discover their location first. With the night wrapped up cold, it sharpened her senses, and feeling content, she took a moment to groom her feathers, bronze and caramel dappled with smoky grey. Her face was pale as milk, as was her underbelly, and the overall effect was that in flight, her appearance was eerie and ghost-like. She flexed her talons, eyeing the hooked points that would fail to skewer flesh until the moon retreated. Fresh movement below made Yvain pause in her preening. A shiver passed through her, and she searched for its source. Her head turned towards a great gnarled oak, and as she stared intently, she saw a cloud of effervescent mist tumble down its cracked trunk. As it descended the timber in silence, the mysterious frothing mass began to separate, spilling down the bark like the tears of the moon herself. Eclipsed by curiosity, Yvain waited and watched, safe on her perch, as the fizzing forms flowed to the ground, moving across it like a stream of stardust. Indeed, they left in their wake a shimmering trail, as if a giant slug or snail had passed that way, winking in the light of the sixpence moon. Yvain finally took to the wing, keeping her eyes trained on the apparitions as they continued to grow and gain definition, transforming into lithe, sinewy beings as they danced and skipped below her. The translucent shapes soon became bodies of tiny torsos and pinched waists, limbs thin as twigs unfurling into hands and feet that moved with nimble grace and were as slim as toothpicks. She could snap them easily. Their ears elongated, stretching to fine points, while their candy floss hair streamed out behind them as they raced onwards. On others, it stood up in messy tufts or framed angular faces like storm clouds. From their backs, Yvain noted each knobble of spine, gauzy appendages unfurled into wings long and tapered, fine veins spider-webbed across their surfaces. With each stage of their metamorphosis, the creatures' bodies took on more solid outlines, albeit ones edged in electric silver, their voices growing stronger and clearer. It was a language that tonight Yvain could understand. They chattered about their midwinter gathering and a special task they had to complete, though there was no mention of what exactly this was. Some clutched pipes and flutes, while others carried harps and one a twisted horn. They flaunted themselves in the moonlight, and their boldness captivated Yvain. They skipped on, and she followed. The tingling they felt from the barn owl's unwavering gaze was as deliciously infuriating as a tickle. Her heart-shaped face was a second moon in their sky, and they delighted in it as their procession trooped towards the enigma of the 13th hour. In the breath of time, between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day morning, it was known mostly by those beings who dwelt within wood and hedgerow, forest and field, above ground and below it, that a gift was bestowed upon all beasts. Indeed, during the 13th hour, all animals had the power to communicate freely and legibly amongst species, even with humans, though very few people realised this or were ever around to hear them. People, however, came in all shapes and sizes, and one never knew who was afoot at such highly energised times of the year. Tonight, a truce also held between predators and prey, as this year, winter solstice aligned with Christmas Eve, adding to the potency of the date. It was a rare occurrence for the two events to coincide, and so proffered an especially sacred space within the season to celebrate midwinter, uniting the animals even more keenly as they gathered to mark the turning of time ahead of lighter days. It also meant that tonight a queen would be crowned in honour of the goddess, the moon, and all eyes would be watching to see whom she would choose. There we go. I'm not wearing owls tonight, wearing badger tonight.
Thank you, Claire, that's lovely.
Thank you.
The next reader is Eddy Baker. Originally from Sutton, South London, Eddy Baker has lived in Belfast since 2018. He has written and performed work at events around Belfast, including 10 by 9 and Accidental Theatre's Accidental Fictions. Eddy lives in East Belfast with his partner Joan and their two cats, Vera and Onion. This is his first published piece of fiction. And just for a little introduction for the story, it is called Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. It's a story about the division of labour between the genders at Christmas, with a little bit of horror in there. And now Eddy will share an extract from Rocking Around the Christmas Tree.
Thank you. I'm going to read from the beginning, so this is truly before it all goes south. Staring at the fireplace, Arlie was momentarily transfixed by the soft flickering orange flames and the gentle crackling of the burning logs. She was enjoying a rare moment of tranquility, the house empty but for the family cat snoozing peacefully on the hearthrug before her. Gazing deep into the flames as they danced and twisted around the wood, Arlie found herself fascinated with its act of consumption, the fire able to devour and destroy just about anything thrown its way. She looked down at her lap, an address book open at the first page and a pile of blank cards and envelopes either side of her. They'd make perfect fuel, she thought for a fleeting moment. Arlie was snapped back into reality by the loud clack of the front door unlocking and the intrusive shudder as it opened inwards, filling the house with the noise of the outside world. "Arlie!" yelled Mark, sounding somewhat out of breath and flustered. "The sheets, Arlie!" Arlie cursed to herself and she jumped up from the sofa as cards and envelopes cascaded onto the floor. She grabbed the pile of old bed sheets she was supposed to have laid out long before Mark's return. "Thanks a lot," huffed Mark, a spike of sarcasm in his voice. Arlie threw the sheets down in front of him, onto a floor already littered with pine needles. Mark dragged the huge tree into the hallway, Arlie pacing ahead of him to lay down further sheets. She'd insisted on this practice after last Christmas, which had seen her spend several January days hoovering up pine needles from every corner. Jake skipped past his parents and merrily giggled at the performance, Daddy grunting and puffing as he dragged the tree, Mummy yelling at Daddy to wait or go as she adjusted sheets on the floor. Eventually, the tree was in the lounge and erected onto its stand, to the gleeful applause of little Jake, who seemed delighted by the haggard monstrosity of a tree his father had chosen. It was the only job Arlie had given Mark, and true to form, he'd half-assed it. She'd given him specific instructions of which garden centre to go to and which type of tree they needed. Of course, she could have gone with him, or gone herself to choose it, but why should she? It was early December, and she'd already set up the Christmas decorations, bought the presents, chosen the wrapping paper, planned the Christmas dinner to the minute, ordered the turkey, sorted a date for Mark's parents to visit, and handmade Jake's first Christmas stocking. And there was still plenty more to do. She'd sent Mark out to pick up the tree with Jake, just so she could have a moment of calm. And yet, even then, she'd remembered the Christmas cards needed doing. Mark's excuse for this mess of a tree was that he'd seen a sign on the dual carriageway directing him to a place selling them at a quarter of the price of those Arlie had sent him to. He'd ended up at some farm in the middle of nowhere, buying a creepy looking faded old pine. "Think of the money we've just saved. That's more for you to spend on the rest of the presents," said Mark. Arlie bit her tongue and collapsed back onto the sofa, reaching down to gather up the piles of cards and envelopes once again. "What are you doing?" Mark yelped. "It's no time to relax now. We need to decorate this, baby." Jake applauded in agreement and watched as his father upended a bag of tinsel, baubles and fairy lights onto the floor. Arlie smiled at Jake before explaining to Mark that she needed to get the cards done, as she wouldn't have any more free time to do it before the last Christmas post. Mark shrugged and got to work grabbing handfuls of tinsel, studiously approaching the tree with the thoughtful expression of a sculptor about to set work on his magnum opus. And sometime around the 30th envelope, Arlie looked up to see an incoherent mess of tinsel and baubles, with a noticeably lopsided arrangement of fairy lights. But she decided not to say anything, having already been made to feel like the killjoy enough for one day. And besides, soon afterwards, she was able to enjoy a hit of Schadenfreude, as the cat suddenly became enraged by an errant strand of tinsel and nearly brought the entire tree down. Mark did not see the funny side of this, chasing the cat out of the room as Jake and Arlie howled with laughter. And I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Eddy. Great. Well, I am the next reader. So just I suppose to introduce myself, I write crime and short stories, and book 2 of my Detective Inspector Harriet Sloane series, Problems with Girls, is launching later on in the month. And I just received funding from the Arts Council to complete my next short story collection. I wrote my story, which is called Black Ice, back in December. It was inspired by the school run and watching the nativity, and much like Eddy's, story there, about the kind of division of labour and the stress of it all. So I'm going to read a little extract of that. Black Ice. The next day, Child Benefit went in. Noelle got credit on her phone and took a bus to the shops. Christmas songs played, all the sad ones. Songs Handsome called Lonely. Songs that managed to resurrect the dead. Crossbars of Zimmer frames clogged each aisle. Everyone needed now the thing behind her trolley. Everywhere she stood, someone got in her way. In badness, it seemed, it was hard not to lose one's shit. It was true, people went mad at Christmas. When she had worked here, she had hated working Christmas. People wanted serving quicker than normal, notwithstanding the longer queues. They had snatched receipts out of her hand and rudely walked away. No, thank you, Noelle had shouted after them. Only a smidge of aggression in her passive aggressiveness. No, you have a happy Christmas. That always got a guilty glance back, if you kept your voice upbeat enough. Aggression had lost all shades of subtlety these days. It was now postbox red and spitting feathers. Noelle would never be that rude customer. She had promised herself. Who forgot that cashiers were humans too? She would say hello and thank them, ask them about their day. That was the plan. Noelle forgot it. In the queue, the cashier chatted to the pregnant woman in front of Noelle as she Tetrised the toys and glanced up periodically. The conversation went on after the transaction was done. Noelle sighed loudly, not meaning to, not able to hold it down. I don't know that woman, explained the cashier, feeling she must explain. She was telling me she's having baby number 6. Mad bitch, muttered Noelle. 2 was enough for me. Too much for me, Noelle said, complaining, but not really complaining. Her 2 were the best mistakes she had ever made. Where would she be without them? The cashier scanned the toys and slipped into a trance. Someone behind was right up against Noelle, a hip and upper arm pushing against her. She turned to look, expecting someone who knew no better, but finding an older woman, designer glasses, fancy clutch bag in her hand, the woman's husband tetrising wine bottles on the belt. Noelle leaned back so she would not be pushed like this, and she was being pushed. She turned again and came nose to nose with a real bad bitch. Well, faced away again and stepped backwards, making sure she stood on toes. Sorry, I didn't know you were so close. Didn't hurt you, did I? The woman stared back, recognizing a real bad bitch before her too. The husband stepped in, incognizant to subtle badness. Wild in here today, isn't it? He said. Oh, it is, said Noelle. Same every year. Only a week to go, said the cashier. How did that creep up on us? And yet they have Christmas on the same day every year, the older woman deadpanned. The cashier half laughed. The woman behind pushed against Noelle again harder. Sorry, said Noelle, because people from Ard say sorry, but never when something is their fault, only when they're wholly not the fault. Do you want past me? The older woman glared. Or do you want me to bend over and that way you can crawl up my ass? The older woman stepped back while her husband stepped forward. So you must have a wee boy and a wee girl, said the cashier, trying to be friendlier. A bomb disposal technician, like Noelle herself had once been. That's not on, I'm going to say something, the man said. Leave it, said the woman through gritted teeth. Oh, those teeth, Noelle knew them well. Those teeth had given her pains in the jaw, down the neck, pains that spread upward. They'd evaded brain scans, those pains. There's no bleeding, no bleed, no tumour, no swelling of any sort. The all clear, they called it, just a plain brain Noelle had. Then she woke one night with a toothache and could not get back over, and that was unusual. Even last night, after the day she had in Belfast, Noelle slept like a log. After the night of toothache, Noelle went to the dentist despite avoiding her for years after cultivating an irrational fear. Your teeth are fine, said the dentist. What you've done is pulled a muscle. Pulled a muscle? In your mouth? Christ, said Noelle. She wouldn't tell anyone that. It sounded like an occupational hazard for porn stars. The dentist said, copy me, do this, and moved her jaw left. Do that, and moved it right. Do this, opened her mouth wide, and that, she closed her mouth. But don't clench your teeth. Noelle did her workout and the headaches left, along with the toothache. Now she saw her whole face as a ball of elastic bands. The cashier was telling her a story about her children. They're all grown up now. Noelle tried to listen. She moved her jaw from side to side, wide open and closed, and looked out at the snow-swollen sky. I'm going to leave it there. So next to read is going to be Zebedee. Okay. Zebedee is a science fiction and fantasy author from Carrickfergus, best known for her novel Inishcarrig, about an alien invasion of Northern Ireland. She also runs the Secret Bookshelf in Carrickfergus. The next story in Underneath the Tree is Angel's Breath. It's a story of family, loss, and constellation. And now Jo is going to read from Angel's Breath.
I'm always the most nervous reader in the room, so I make everyone feel good. This is Angel's Breath. Winter was Mum's favourite time of the year. I can imagine her now as if she were alive in her red bobble hat and fixed scarf. She loved the crisp days and sharp frosts. When there was snow in the forecast, she'd sit by the window, blinds open, to watch for it. She had flipped between weather forecasts until she found one that said heavy snow, and then she had promised such drifts of 6 feet when all we got was sleet. From the first appearance of Orion in the sky, the winter hunter, to the dark days of January, my mother came alive. Until last year. Last year, my mother died. On her last night in the hospice room, the rain that had been splashing the windows stopped, and a cold descended so that the path outside sparkled in the darkness. She wouldn't let us draw the curtains, just as she never had on winter nights. An hour later, from nowhere, at least not on any forecast any of us knew of, the snow arrived. Real snow, thick from the Arctic, the type that sticks. It fell heavier and heavier, covering the path and shrouding the bushes until we were held in the room. It felt like the window was the glass of a snow globe and that we were just figures to be shook up, our lives crashing around us. It was Mark who bent over and whispered for Mum to look outside. She'd always open her eyes for him, her golden son, smart and funny. She adored him and me, and we always knew it. Her heavy eyes opened, and she saw the snow and smiled, and she was still smiling when she died. Grief ripped me. I put up no trees that Christmas, although Dad did try. He drew the line at the reindeer in the garden low, said he'd always hated the evil-looking git. I barely got out of the bed on the day itself, and only did so because Noreen wanted me to go to her house for the meal. That's my daughter, taking care of me. She claimed it'd break the day and save her dragging Abby and the baby out. But I knew the real reason. We'd never had Christmas in her house before. I doubted she'd even know what to do with a turkey, but I said yes, because we hoped it wouldn't be like in my house, where I'd be seeing my mother Christmas past at every corner. Except, of course, I still seen her, reading the crackled jokes loudly, making us put on the hats for the pictures, pictures upon pictures upon pictures, my lifetime stretching in a series of cracker hats. Noreen didn't have crackers on the table. She knew none of us would be able to look at a hat, let alone wear one, just as we all knew the jokes were never really funny. I still saw Mum through January, past her birthday in February and into March. Quick glances of someone ahead of me on the path who I was sure was her. The red cobble hat of the dog walker, the exact shade of red, the same jaunty step, her voice singing along to Queen, asking not to stop now. On Mother's Day, I cried like I was a child again, and there was no one to hold me, shush me, tell me things would be fine. It was Mark who tried to pull me up. He came into the kitchen one bright day and took out one of the chairs. The tulips were drowsy on the windowsill, marking the end of the winter. I have a new job, he announced, slightly smug. He sat on the chair back to front the way he always did. Said his legs were too long the other way. Pour us a cup of coffee, and I'll tell you about it. That was how Mark coped, keeping busy, keeping connecting, reminding me and Dad that life had to go on. It's what one would have wanted, he said, and he was right, I suppose. I managed to rouse myself and make the tea. My limbs felt heavy, as if I was moving underwater, but that was the new normal. So what's the job, I asked, without much hope of understanding. Mark works in astrophysics. I can't tell you how pleased Mum was when that happened. She said it was all down to her introducing him to the stars as a child, which didn't explain why I've ended up as a corporate manager in the health service, but hey ho. Evidence does as evidence likes. I'm working on the Orion Nebula project. He took the cup from me and dunked 5 sugars in it. I managed not to tell him again that it was impossible to taste more than 3. We're launching a probe later this year. It'll put the Hubble to shame. Little Abby wandered in, 3 years old and cheeky as could be. Tuesdays were my days for doing the childminding. Mostly Tuesdays were what kept me going. What's a nebula, she asked. Oh, you'll like it, said Mark as she climbed on his knee. She loved him, called him her Uncle Mark, even though he's technically the next generation up. He said he wasn't about to add the great to his name just yet. It's a stellar nursery. I had visions of nurses tucking stars into bed and singing them to sleep. He grinned at me, and I reckoned he knew exactly what I was thinking. I couldn't help smiling back. It's where stars are born, Abby. How cool is that? He tapped the table at me. We're going to capture a star being born on camera so we can all see it closer than anyone else has managed to. When, I asked, because okay, a childhood of watching the stars made the idea of seeing one being born pretty cool. A prickle made my arm jerk and twitch as if I was breaking free of the cocoon I'd been in. In about 100 years, he replied deadpan. And then he asked me for one of Mum's lipsticks. And when he explained why, I had to hunt one out of the box I'd taken of her personals from the hospice and give it to him. And inside, for the first time, I felt a flicker of something like excitement. And that's me.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Jo. Very nice. Okay. To follow Jo is Simon Maltman. I'm going to read from your bio, Simon. Just to introduce, Simon Maltman is the Austro-Noir author of novels, novellas, and short stories. An Amazon bestseller, he also splits his time working as a musician and as a tour guide on his Belfast Noir tour. He lives in County Down with his wife and 2 daughters. And Simon's story is called Sleigh Ride, but it's a clever play on words. So it's S-L-A-Y, Sleigh Ride, and it's a horror story. It takes us on a horror-filled trip in the sleigh with a real anti-hero. And Simon's going to share from Sleigh Ride now.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to start at the beginning and just read the first couple of pages, give you an idea. My first foray into doing a bit of horror. It was definitely good fun trying that in lockdown. The reindeer tore through the sky with such force, it appeared as if the Tower of London might crumble as they rushed past it. The reins were pulled tighter, his grip firm. An empty alley in Whitechapel was found to set down for a few minutes so he could have a smoke of his pipe. St. Nicholas exhaled heavily, his breath already like smoke, wisping away from his dirty white beard. Good boys, he said gruffly, placing a hand on Comet's back. His thick, dark green coat was smeared with ash and soot. Its plump outline heaved in and out with every breath. The shadowy night was freezing and unforgiving. He reached inside the coat and rummaged for his pipe. In one day, it would be Christmas Day. In a week, and the year of 1889 would begin. St. Nicholas would see neither. The knife was already at his throat before old St. Nick knew anything of the attack. He hadn't time to react before the blade sliced through his neck and throat. He stood up, staggering, his hands grasping at his throat. The reindeer knew something was wrong, making guttural keening sounds. The noises from St. Nicholas were no better. His fingers couldn't stop the flow. Immediately, his stained coat was splattered with thick blood. Soon it would turn red. He fell over the side of the sleigh and out onto the hard cobblestones. He was dead before he hit the ground. Jack wiped the blade on his long, flowing black coat, then hid it back inside his breast pocket. He stood over his prey. It was him. That man with many names. Now he was dead. He had several himself. Leather Apron, the Whitechapel murderer, Jack the Ripper. The alley was deathly quiet. He regarded the dead saint with his cold stare, then looked down at his own clothes. Beneath his black coat was an old grey suit with a butcher's apron on top of it. It was streaked with new blood and marbled with various shades from previous ventures. He scratched at his chin, then at the handlebar moustache. Checking over his shoulder, he pulled off his coat in a flurry and threw it to the wet ground. Then Jack heaved the body roughly back and forth until he managed to pull off the thick green coat. He wrapped it around himself, swamping his lean shape within it. The 4 reindeer turned to look at him. Scornfully, he thought. He leaned over the sleigh and pulled up the huge covering at the back. As he looked beneath it, his eyes danced inside his head. He pulled the cover back down before climbing up onto the wooden seat. There the reins lay idle on the dusty and scored mahogany floor. Tentatively, he sat for a moment and held the long black leather between his knees. Then he stood, bracing himself. He raised the reins and all at once whipped them down on the beast, roaring, "Yeah." The reindeer responded instantly, galloping forwards along the alley. Faster, faster they went, as he wildly whipped the reins up and down. "Come on, blast you," he cried. Then up they climbed, higher and higher. Jack let out a gasp as they inched over the top of a ragged tenement block. "Ha," he screamed, a freakish delight etched on his face. They soared high over Westminster Palace. Though only a few decades old, the stone already seemed dulled, worn down by the wickedness of the city, or at the very least now coated in a layer of the city's dirt and filth. Around and round they circled the city. Jack cackled at his most maniacal as they swept low over Tower Bridge, still only half completed. The huge coat shielded him against the biting wind. Operating the sleigh felt strangely simple, natural. It was as if there was a power emanating from the coat itself. He led his reindeer back towards Whitechapel.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon.
Next is a story that was co-written by Angeline Adams and Remco van Straten. Angeline, you're reading the story, is that right? Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
So just to introduce the co-writers of this story, Remco van Straten and Angeline Adams wrote for Verbal Magazine, Culture, Northern Ireland, and 14 Times before deciding it was time to focus on their own stories instead of writing about those of others. Their fiction is steeped in their shared love for folklore and history and draws on elements of Angeline's County Down childhood and the northern Dutch coast where Remco grew up. And this story is called Special Dispatch, and it will transport you back to a time of turf fires and fair folk.
Thank you. Not even half a year later, of the 11 local lads who'd gone to France, only Jim and Barry, the schoolmaster's son, were left. And Declan, of course. Poor Declan. Jim glanced towards Declan's station as usual whenever he thought of his uncle. Barry saw him looking and hoisted his mug of muddy tea. "Here's to you, Declan. Merry Christmas," he called out. There was no answer from where Declan held his lonely vigil, though they knew he'd be grinning. "Merry Christmas," whispered Jim, glad for once that his voice had been hoarse for days. He had the catch in his throat and the tears that he could just hold back. Barry was not the worst when you got to know him better, but he'd always had to look big at Jim's expense, calling him "our wee Jimmy," and asking him how he'd been doing at school. He knew damn well that Jim had left school the year before to work on the farm, and that he didn't write too well. Though the other lads had left school early too, they'd followed suit, and wee Jimmy had caught on. Never with Uncle Declan, though, who'd begun calling him Jim. "You're a man now, Jim," he said. "And men like us, we see a job that needs doing, and we do it." Jim had even swaggered a little, feeling like a man with a future in the army. All of the others were gone now, and though his uncle was still with them, he no longer talked to anyone. Barry, by process of elimination, had become Jim's friend on the front. George was the first of the village boys to go. He'd been too slow and caught lead. One moment they'd heard his wheezing behind them as they ran back to their trench through no man's land, and then they hadn't. John Collins' number came up next. He'd been feverish all week, which in itself was nothing unusual in the trenches, but as he persisted his duties while growing visibly weaker, the men had begun to look askance at him. "I think you've proved you're not a shirker, John," Declan said. "You'd better report to the sick bay, for our sakes as well as yours. What if it's contagious?" "Rot," said Barry. "Trench fever's not contagious." He agreed with Declan, though, and John was whisked away, and then he was dead. They buried him in what they called the West Wing, with the other victims of disease. Barry took his boots and his overcoat, and shrugged when they told him those were not his to take. John's brother Jacob died just a week later, not of the fever, but of what? Nobody could rightly say. Jacob's death made Jim realize how little changed with the absence of any one man. The weather got colder. The stink of the trench grew pungent, and another pair of boots, another overcoat changed hands. The war churned on. The trench lengthened, and even when, in line with operational requirements, they had to move and dig a new trench, it was still the same one, always the same trench. This is what Orpheus must have found when he descended into Hades, Barry once complained, an eternity of freezing water, shit and rats. God, what I would give to have him liven things up a bit here with his harp. At that, Declan leaped up, grabbed Jim and swung him round. Come, my darling, let us dance to Orpheus's merry tunes. Horsey, horsey, carry me higher. Death's come to fetch me, you'll never get tired. Of course they themselves had changed. They all wore the military jargon and the rules uneasily at first, like a new Sunday suit that only gets comfortable with repeated use. Underneath their newfound identity as the king's soldiers, they were still fundamentally themselves, though, except for Declan. With each explosion, each shower of mud, and each bullet that whistled over their heads, Jim saw a bit more of his uncle being torn away. Although Declan still laughed with Barry and the others, as before, Jim saw that behind his eyes and smile there was very little left of the man he knew from home. Nevertheless, Barry was the first to notice that something was seriously amiss with Declan. They hadn't really liked one another at first, until they found that they shared a certain sense of humour. They each hammed their part up, and the others took to calling them the Professor and the Fool. And then one day Declan said something that threw Barry. It was enough to drag Jim out of his own thoughts, and enough for him to realise that more and more Declan was talking about getting out. And that's it.
Yeah, Angeline. And Remco, of course.
Thank you very much.
The next story is by Stacie Davis, but if you want to read this story, you're going to have to buy this anthology.
Teasing you.
I still want to read out Stacie's bio. Okay. Stacie Davis is a writer from Black Hill, and author of Ellie Bird's Greatest Regret, which is an anthology, as well as her debut novel, which is called Fairy Tale Twist. And with her primary school teachers always describing her as a daydreamer, Stacie has been a lifelong reader, creator, and enjoyer of fantasy worlds. And the story that she has in the anthology, it's a lovely Christmas love story, which kind of balances out everything really nicely. And we're going to move on now to the last, and I haven't missed anybody out at all, sure I haven't. We're going to move on to the last story in the anthology, which is by Mourinho Sullivan. And to introduce Morna, Mourinho Sullivan has always loved stories. From County Antrim, she is a member of the Coney Island Writers Group, and she's won a few writing competitions and had short stories and poems published, and is still chasing that elusive deal. And her story, which is the final story in Underneath the Tree, is called Secret Santa, and it tells that relatable and hilarious story of, you know, the overeager office worker around the kind of office festivities, who wants to take ownership for all of the workplaces Christmas goings on. And now Morna is going to share an extract from Secret Santa. Thank you, Morna.
Okay. Henry loved everything about Christmas. He made the season stretch all year. In January, he hunted for Christmas wrapping paper and crackers reduced in the sales. He bought Christmas presents throughout the year. He made his Christmas cards in the summer and began organising the office Christmas dinner in August. He put up his tree on the 1st of November and started writing his Christmas cards later that month. He organised the office Secret Santa in December and planned and hosted the family dinner and get-together on the day itself. He had never lost his childlike innocence and excitement of the festival, and his work colleagues in the Anderson and Murdoch sales office were secretly relieved that they weren't asked to organise the office Christmas party each year. It was a thankless task, and yet Henry embraced it with vigour, joy and enthusiasm, as he did with most jobs, announcing before Prue had bought her children's new school uniforms that it was time to think of this year's party. Jolene was thankful they had Henry. Every office needed someone just like him to think of where they might go for dinner, design the seating plan, and deal with the complaints on the day. She admired how Henry coped with all these issues gracefully, never complaining, always smiling and agreeing to take on board suggestions for next year to make it even better. Managing this team certainly brought her daily challenges. If only everyone could be a bit more like Henry, especially Cathy. She seemed to find fault with everything, including Henry's chirpy emails that announced Christmas was approaching. 14th of August. Colleagues, we've reached that wonderful time of the year again when it's time to think of the Christmas party. Are you excited yet? Only 130 days to go. The time, Friday the 22nd of December. The place, you decide. I don't want to step on anyone's toes, so if anyone else would like to organise the party this year, let me know. Happy to step aside or to step up and do it once more. As always, I'm happy to consider suggestions for this year's venue, but to kick the discussion off, I'm suggesting O'Malley's, just for a change, the new Italian in the Bridges Centre, Veni Vidi Vici, there's been great reports in the paper, and the Victoria Hotel, if you're feeling flush. Their entertainment looks good. Anyway, please vote using the buttons on the top of the email by this Friday to let me know your preference or suggest other choices. Menus are attached for all three venues. Ciao for now, Henry. P.S. I've let my preference slip, haven't I? Later that day, round the tea point, everyone had an opinion about where might be a better Christmas dinner venue, but no one wanted to take the task off Henry's hands. Thanks for the reminder I need to buy the school shoes, Henry. Have you thought of the old Keys Inn? Martin's work stew was there last year. He loved it. Might be worth a try. But all your ideas sound fine to me, said Prue. It's good, and so's the park. But all those you've suggested have good bars and good food. What more do we need? Asked Sean. I like something less traditional. You get fed up with turkey, don't you? A Chinese banquet might be good for a change. But I like the sound of Veni Vidi Vici too. Jolene smiled at Henry. Well, it's up to all of you. You know I'm happy to go anywhere and happy to organise it unless someone else wants to, he replied. What about the buffet at the Riverside Hotel? It's great value. Cathy pushed her way past him to grab milk out of the fridge. The Victoria Hotel seems a bit pricey for what you get. Well, they all are. But then they stick on an extra tenner for the privilege of being squashed round the table at Christmas. And I wouldn't go back to O'Malley's. My main course was awful last year, and the portions were small. It's really not worth the money. It wasn't that bad, Cathy. You maybe made the wrong choice. My salmon was good. See if they'll throw in cocktails and get a good deal for us, said Prue. I'll see what I can do. I wanted it to be even better than last year's. Now, don't forget to vote. Henry counted down the days to Christmas on a spreadsheet every year, which included the strict timetable he adhered to in planning his Christmas traditions. The countdown to when his Christmas tree went up, when he wrote and posted his Christmas cards, when he baked his Christmas cake, when he wrapped his Christmas presents, when he started watching Christmas films, when it was acceptable to begin listening to Christmas music, when he organised the Christmas jumper charity day in work, and his favourite event of all, when he organised the office Secret Santa.
Good point to leave that on. Great, thanks very much, that's fabulous.
I think we all know somebody that's a bit counting down. See it on Facebook. I've got people counting down since, you know, X days to Christmas, and know a few Henrys.
Yes, everyone will now be known as a Henry, who's over here. Yeah.
And just on Stacey's story, I meant to say earlier, but didn't want to interrupt you. North Coast people will know quite a few places in Stacey's story as well, because it's sort of set in around Coleraine, and there's a few. There's a local people, a wee local man as well that you might recognise. So that's another little teaser for you to go and get it and read it.
Well, it was, again, lots of little messages coming through, everyone, to say how brilliant you all were reading. I think it's really showcased the variety of work and the strength of the work in the anthology. And Claire, you and I have really got to know each story very, very well, you know, from the initial submission editing and format.
Yeah.
Reading, we've read these stories so many times, and that's just another dimension, isn't it, to hear them read by.
It's nice to hear them, yeah, and somebody reading their own work. It's always, it's different and it's nice, and yeah, so hopefully everybody else enjoyed them, because yeah, we know, you think you know something well, and then you hear somebody else read it, and just, as you say, brings it to life. So
yeah,
that's great.
Absolutely. I know that a lot of people